The United States is in a state of serious passenger flight.
We fear this. We fear that they have something else that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. You get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone fixed me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Welcome to Varn Blog Solo, and today I am going for my epic turnaround. I might sound a little weak. I've talked a lot today, not just on a 2-hour stream, but also I ended up talking to my publisher and my family back in Georgia, who are worried about me. Also worried that I might be overexerting myself, which is sort of a given. One of the interesting effects of COVID is I sleep a lot more, but you wouldn't know it. My average nightly sleep is about 5.5 hours, and lately I've been sleeping about 10. But anyway, that's a digression as we begin tonight's discussion, and I wrap up my series of solo things. You might get another one of these in a couple of months. You might get them over the summer. They tend to come out when I don't have anything else to do. And one of the interesting things about COVID is, under isolation, what else am I gonna do? I reading a couple of things. Reading this book by Robert M. Price, Merely Christianity, and I'm reading. In fact, I'll go grab it. Oedipus, or the Legend of the Conqueror, which is a French text that was highly influential to René Girard. This translation came out a few years ago from Michigan State University Press and from the Studies in Violence, Mimesis, and Culture series. So if you're interested in such things. I want to talk a little bit about my book, read some poems from it, talk about the mission of the press, which is an explicitly anti-communism press, etc. and so forth. But I also wanted to address, I said a couple months ago that I was going to be doing a lot less of this stuff. And believe it or not, I fully intend to go back to doing a lot less of this stuff except for interviews. Interviews are easy for me to do. I interview people whose work I'm already familiar with. And if I'm not familiar with it, I just take a couple of hours and read up on what I can. It's impossible to know everything, and you shouldn't trust anyone who pretends to, but it's not hard to do enough work to do a good podcast interview. It just takes some intuition on what kinds of questions to ask. And so you might notice that I'll be doing a lot more interviews in the future. And to be honest with you, one of the reasons why Varn Blog is what it is, as opposed to my other podcasts like Mortal Science, is that Mortal Science, for every hour of it you get, there's usually 2 to 3 hours of recording and 10 to 15 hours of research. And even then, there's often cul-de-sacs and debates. This is a lot easier to produce. But on to my book. So the book is coming out from Mysterioso Books and Novelty, which is Terry Tapp's press. You might know Terry from a Zero book about half a decade ago called Surf Journal, which was about a wildcat strike that he was involved in. Terry is also a fairly significant visual artist, has stuff in Chelsea, and he's also like Sean KB over at Antifada. You know, he does manual labor when he's not being a professor. I consider Terry a friend. He used to be involved with the Acid Left podcast. I think he still is. But I'm not going to go into anyone's personal information. Just by to say that the last 2 years have not been easy on him. And I haven't been easy on a lot of us. I'm sure many of you are in the same boat. But he accepted this book, Liberation and All the Bright, etc., at the beginning of the pandemic. And it's been about 1.5 years since we went through the final proof together. And today he called me and we talked a lot about it. And because he posted the book was coming out in December, he started accepting orders for it. But there's been some issues with the printer, and there's, everyone's down on labor right now. So in the next 2 weeks, I should have my author's copies in hand. Liberation and all the Bright, etc. was written over the period of about 4 years. It's a poetry book. And as a poetry book, it is not necessarily obvious what it is about. It also requires you to have some knowledge of both Buddhist and Christian theology, as well as communist history, because I'm an asshole like that. I think didactic political art generally sucks, and so I don't write it. And but this is about that. So I'm going to read you guys a couple poems, and we'll go on to the next conversation. These are poems that are in the book. So this poem, Words of My Perfect Teachers. He said one can swim up current into the stream of tears if you tolerate the brief tender shock of salt in your mouth. He taught the rustle of pine needles can be a dance, or the promise of an evening, or the taking in of the gasp of the ghost, to which you should feed even your last sap of marrow of your bones. She said to me, we should tumble the dry sheets that you hoist yourself with, red shifting into the past and the future. It is only the point. There is life. Breathe lightly, something dim, then pinpricks of light moving even in the distance. She taught me poems can guide the trembling hand of a Georgia boy with dulled razors and a natural sponge to cut away the tumors from love, to use the milk to leach the blood from your apron. He taught me to dye the evening with cochineal and allium, slightly deeper than blood. That in that is hope, like minstrel stains. She said that there was no string theory, only filaments to tie us to the wires, which grew fiber optic, contained the ones and zeros of our autobiographies and apologias. And then, when change comes in botched code, time in retrograde, she whispered that 8 legs was too many and 7 too few. He taught me that the seas were never silent, and ragged claws would be sharpened to cut away something altogether uncouth. He taught me silence, to take in the arid smoke of the back spasms and microtumors, barely benign, and to cough the gaslight yellow, transformed into the fractured and brittle compassion, just warm enough to thaw the dry ice frozen heart and soften icicle speech into arsenic crystal and ragged glitter. They taught that after the ghosts drunk all the wine and the marrow we have left them, the air will be still, and there will not be greater tragedy than youth, and no greater gift than the beer stopped breakage when your titanium jaw begins to your titanium jaw being exposed as fragmented glass. And here's another poem from that same book. Anger Song. I'm tired, too tired to write about trees or to care about punchlines. After all, art, we are told, should be in service to service, and I am tired, and I should clean my gun. There is nothing about service in the fading of the tulip branch, or in the explosion of junipers in the recent combustion engines of western forest, dried to the frayed and brittle kindling crisps. I have the revolvers to reach for, op-eds to write, slogans to scrawl on cardboard, and our monthly ritual of speaking truth to power that is eternally far away and already knew it anyway. Poetry makes nothing happen. We write about it anyway. I need to test my generator. I need to organize the meaning, organize the lesson plan, create a pedagogy of resistance, as if the Polish could survive on friction, as if the poets were the unacknowledged legislatures of the universal demos, as if we needed one more godforsaken apologia from another who wants to do blueprints for the infrastructure of the city of God in unrhymed couplets. I would want to watch the world burn, but it's mundane and commonplace now, and so even that is boring. I would hide this in metaphor, but I'd rather clean the barrel of an obsolete revolver. I would rather write about trees, but they are in flames somewhere on the California countryside. I mean, people would be more likely to understand that, and then maybe, just maybe, I could sleep and just not fucking write about it. One more poem, and then we'll do some talking. Maybe if you want to ask me what these are about or whatever. This is from Dated. This was written when I came back to America. This is from about 4 years ago. Dated, which this poem is dated now. This is the year Russian hackers stole everything, including our will to live. Fire sale for the heart-shaped boxes and personal ambitions on the deep web. Bitcoin only, please. So much ado about phishing. Easy passwords are the gateway to the soul. In the light of the news, the past feels poorly yet puke green, and poetry feels less flippant, although the constant stretching for hypnosis renders the verses down to flip strings of broken bargain basement prose. So all the names have been changed to protect the guilty, and we laser edge the glass boys so their jaws are defined, hiding their hairline cracks and jagged shards, cutting the air like sharks or like the pretense of jealousy. Not all I know are affected. Not even the clearest telescope could I see it, the glimmer of the future, the silver lining of the nebula cloud. Yes, everything is encrypted. Even your animal, stupid, knotted meat lump of a heart won't have its secrets uncoded for at least 2 decades of pure mathematics. Yes, we should mean goodbye when we say it. Yes, there's traces of arsenic in the mulled wine. Yes, the patrons have written old rubber checks and we can bounce the future along them. I hear echoes of acres in Siberia we can barter for. The Russians drift the current to the Bahamas from Vladivostok. New leases on yet life not entirely repossessed. Hell, I'll read one more. Teachings on severance. One should have no love of pain, yet wrecked tissue rent from use has its pristine shock. Freshly open, the joint of a javelina, splayed cartilage, perfect symmetry, slick white gleam, curvature like the arc of the sky. I understand the woman, tear-soaked, watching the frontal suture. Fibers replacing the the calcium-rich bone, calming herself with sacral breathing, steady hands as she stitches each fleshy seam. We know corpses have their use. No necessary cruelty, no tramadol to see sleep from immaculate triggering. I would let her use my femur as a horn to guide ghosts and turkey vultures to dinner. And when the floods rise, I hope whatever's left on my hand can use the cap of my skull for a cup. Solace is to be of use, like a steer skull home to a hive of honeybees. You guys could tell I was in an optimistic mood when I wrote that. So what liberation is actually about is the idea that, oh God, I can recommend tons of poetry to you. What do you want to read? If you wanted, I would, if you wanted to understand what I write, I would read a lot of Eastern European and Latin poetry. By Latin, I don't mean Latin as in Catullus. I mean Latin as in Pizarnik, Alejandro Pizarnik, or Octavio Paz, or Nicanor Pera. All those are pretty readily available in good translations in English. The Eastern European poet's a little more difficult. I'm also into South Korean poetry. But if you're not into poetry and you want to read some good poets, I would tell people start with Auden and stuff like that, actually. No, but liberation is about a lot of people projecting things upon what they don't really understand. Good, you can read it in Spanish. And read it in Spanish. The Spanish reads better in Spanish. I was talking to, man, I'm being awfully personal tonight, but I was talking to one of my girlfriends, a weak word. Lover sounds skeevy, but let's say one of my ex-partners. And we were talking about, and her family's Colombian. And we were talking about how, like, a lot of Spanish poetry seems almost apoplectic or hyperbolic in English. It just doesn't. Its residences are, the emotional residences are overstated. Because they don't feel as, you could read a lot of Persian poets, man. Rumi is a good start, although they're a better translation than Coleman Bart. I wish I could endorse Coleman Bart's translations. I like Coleman Bart's work, but he made a lot of that shit up. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but I think it's readily known now. Yeah. I do. I really like Rumi. I really like Rubaiyats as well, just in general. You could do worse, actually, if you wanted to get a good overview of poetry, than buying like those little everyman's pocket poetry and going from like the little collection called Persian poets, Parisian poets, 100 Tong poets. Educate yourself on more than just Western poetry. I mean, Western poetry has other roots anyway. That's my thing. I particularly like Spanish poetry because I can read Spanish. I read Spanish way better than I speak it. And I like German poetry, but again, I can read it in the original. One of the things I love about Spanish versus English, right? English is an awfully inconcise language. We have to like have 50 helping words to build a sentence in English, right? Because it's a pidgin language. It's a, conglomeration of like Latin, French, German, Old High German, Frisian, etc. Yeah. So Liberation was written I was been working for Zero. Well, I mean, people know the story. Apocalyptics was my first book. It came out in 2018. And I wrote that book for 13 years. Well, what really I mean by that is I wrote the book in my MFA between 2004 and 2008 or 7. And then I rewrote it in 2008, sent it out for publication, sent it to like 5 different publishers, got no bites. Then in 2017, when my ex-wife was diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma cancer and had over 100 tumors. So she's still alive, which is kind of proves to you the miracle of highly developed science. Let's actually talk about that someday. This is kind of embarrassing, and I say this as a person who drinks soda so they don't drink other things. But I got super depressed, stocked up on a whole lot of airport liquor, and just during Ramadan on a weekend, drove out to the outside of Cairo because I was staying in Cairo. I had to send her home to Wyoming and then to Salt Lake. It's how I ended up here, if you ever want to know that story. As soon as iftar hit, I got super drunk and went out to the edge of the desert, drove out past Katamea, out, all the way out on the Ring Road in Egypt. And if you don't know where the Ring Road is a crazy, crazy place. I was not driving drunk because you can die on the Ring Road sober. I wasn't driving. I don't drive in Egypt. I took a taxi out there and then walked to the edge of the desert where I probably shouldn't have been, and laid out there for 16 hours with just water and myself. And started going back over the poems in my head. And I resolved that night that I was going to rewrite the book as soon as I was sober, and that's what I did. So I rewrote my first book, and it became a book called Apocalyptics. And about half the poems are from 2017, and about half the poems are from like 15 years ago. Unfortunately, the book, which has if you haven't seen the cover, let me see if I can grab it. Hold on. You must forgive me for breaching streamer etiquette and disappearing for a second, but I'm going to go grab that book for you. This is my first book. Okay, so 13 years in the making. Came out in 2018 from a Louisiana press called Unlikely Books. You will notice that it has this piece of art by the British French artist Adrian Kenyon on it. That was my request. I didn't design the rest of it. My publisher thought it would be cool to make it look like a self-published metal album cover. And it was kind of cool. But it didn't. It actually hurt its ability to be marketed because everyone thought it was self-published. But the original piece of art here was actually for the time period, which was about dealing with my ex-wife and living in Egypt, and then also the Gulf War. And originally this was Osama bin Laden on it with the I Have Americans on it, and George Bush. If you actually look at the finer details of the book cover, you can see all this stuff that are references to like conspiracy theories in the mid-aughts. That's because any politics in this book is actually from that time period. When they updated it to Trump to help it sell, it did help it sell, actually. It's one of the top selling books of Unlikely Books, which is not saying much because it's a poetry press, right? But it actually misleads people to what the book is about. Liberation is kind of written in response to that. I wrote 2 manuscripts. One that was the first draft of Liberation, all that by etc., and one which is a book that I have not done anything with yet, although I might release it through either one of these presses, Mysterioso or Unlikely if they'll take it, called After the Laughter, which is an even darker book, if you can believe that. Anyway, my poetry is not known for my vital and uplifting sense of humor. Liberation is kind of a sequel to this, but it's about coming to terms with your limitations and your mortality. And it's about a lot of the stuff I did to kind of get a hold of myself. Now, yes, I'm a dirty, hard materialist Marxist and have been for years. But during this time period, I spent a lot of time at a Buddhist monastery, like seriously, when I was in South Korea. I spent a lot of time like hanging out in the desert in Cairo. I spent a lot of time meeting people, moving through different classes of people, learning what you're supposed to learn, which is how to move, how to like adjust your habitus and learn how to move and interact with people from all different social classes, which is actually directly relevant to the mission of Mysterioso Books and Novelty. I'll talk about that in a little while. It was also about coming to terms with the violence of a lot of psychological conditions. For those who don't know, I'm being ridiculously personal for a stream. I will admit this because it's somewhat public knowledge, but and don't ask me why. But I have a lot of the personality traits of people who are soldiers. When I hang out in certain groups where I hang out with soldiers, they tend to think I'm one of them, and that's because I'm well traveled, can move between social classes, and have the triggers of someone with PTSD. The ways I make eye contact with people and stuff like that, people misread me as being on the spectrum, or these other things that people tend to do when they overly psychologize other people. Yeah. And diagnose them themselves, which they should absolutely never do. I have, and I'm not just saying this is not a self-diagnosis. I have pretty severe PTSD. And what liberation is about is trying to come to terms with that. Like trying to come to terms with how you got to where you're at and what it meant. And the kinds of extreme situations and violence that it can mean. One of the things I always would tell people, when we talk about revolution or whatever, and I would always say, like, look, Josh Whedon sucks and Serenity's a dumb movie, but there is one part of that movie that I've always thought was correct. that if you were a warrior for a utopian or revolutionary society, right, and you really believed in that, you would do the Jose Marti thing. You would not go into that society as a leader, or probably not even engage in it at all, because what it would take for you to be a part of that society is like you're a product of the old world. You are the old wineskin. They can't put new wine in you. And the kind of violence that it would take to do that thing, if you were a violent insurrectionary revolutionary, would instantiate a lot of the values of power hoarding, of distrust, of not being willing to even trust your peers. All right. The paranoia would be sincere and real and necessary. Right. And so the most responsible thing for you to do in that situation would be to not take power. You would take power for your class or your group, but you personally would have to abdicate that responsibility. It would be the right thing to do because you had done things that would make it hard for you to function in that society. And I don't think people, when people throw around revolution, I don't think about this, and I think about it because of the PTSD. And I think about it a lot in liberation. Like, what would it mean to be liberated? And if you brought that world about, you probably couldn't participate in that. And so to do that, you really would, in some ways, be removing yourself and fighting for something bigger than yourself, right? Because if you were fighting for yourself in that scenario, you probably wouldn't bring about the society you want to bring out. I mean, I always talk about, I talk about Stalin a lot, actually, and I don't mean it to defend him or demonize him. I find Stalin to be a fascinating individual, but I also think, given like Stalin was a paranoid true believer and a smart man. And a lot of what he did, even to his own colleagues, came out of the fact that he never got out of the mode of what it took to get the Bolsheviks in power in the first place. And while that may have protected his own government and himself, it also ultimately led to there being no real way to build up people to replace him. And you see that in the Soviet leadership. You see it across the board, and you see it in this purging of the military, etc. All right, this is not, this caricature of someone like Stalin, and Stalin in many ways, even by my standards, is did some world historically horrible things. And I'm not, but I remember listening to Jordan Peterson, of all people, on a clip that Douglas Lane cited, and Peterson was like, if you were in that situation, what makes you think you would have been any better? And I actually, one of the few things that Peterson has ever said that I thought had a fucking point. Even Trotsky said late in his life, he didn't say he would be Stalin. In fact, he personally blamed Stalin for a lot. But he said that even he would have been a Bonaparte figure in Russia if he came in power in that time. And when I wrote Liberation, I was thinking about that. I was thinking about that a lot. I was thinking about what it would take to come out of those kinds of traumas and kinds of strivings and kinds of violence that a lot of people just don't know. I used to say offhanded to people, yeah, and I know this sounds horribly violent, but if you're going to talk about revolution and you're going to fight the most powerful militaries the world has ever known, your question should not be, are you willing to kill your enemies or the bourgeoisie or whatever? That's not actually the right question. The question would be, would you be willing to take out a comrade that you've known for all your life that you don't think is a traitor if they got captured, to save other people's lives? And could you do it? And could you live it yourself? And if you can't even ask yourself that question, you don't need to talk about violence. And liberation is partly about that. It's also about sexual liberation. It's about the relationship between men and women. That's all in there. Men of whatever body and women of whatever body. Right? And anything in between. I'm constantly asked things like, what is my sexuality? And I actually flippantly answer that I don't have one. That I think sexuality is somewhat of a trap. A very Foucauldian answer, a very cop-out answer, right? But it's also one I kind of believe. People tend to be more fluid in different stages of their life than they want to admit, and then identities can easily hold. Now, you can also be like, I'm a special snowflake and no one else is like me with this shit. And that's not what I'm encouraging you to do. I think you should see people as a spectrum of things that are constantly changing and ultimately inconsistent. Because people are constantly changing and ultimately inconsistent. Because the material world that forms them and they're interacting with is constantly changing and ultimately inconsistent. And any narrative you have to make sense of that is going to fall short. Well, yeah, if someone really makes me pin down a narrative, I'll say I'm straight or heteroflexible or some shit like that. Which is not even totally true. It's just closest to the right answer because I don't want to claim any power identity, right, that I don't really want to own. Like, I'm not going to claim to be oppressed when I'm not. Right? Like for example, I used to do a lot of sleep with this because, Esri and I will talk about being off-white, which is like these groups that have ancestries that are historically can kind of, if you're in WAF circles, are kind of questionable. And if you have a multiracial, multi-ethnic background, like my family kind of does, but my personal family has people in it who are Black and people in it, but married in, and my aunt's Korean, my cousins are biracial, some of them are white. All of us have actual multiple ethnicity. When I say we're white, it means we look white and we identify white. People socially identify us as right. Thus, we have the appearance of white skin privilege, right? But when you move in certain WASP circles, this actually becomes a tell of your social class. And it's also a tell of your ethnic background because you're not a person who comes from wealth. And so, I've never argued against the idea of white skin privilege. I think it's very real, but the conflation of that with white wealth or whatever is just a statistical lie. And so I always feel very strange about it when I would have waspy liberals literally lecturing me about whiteness when they're blonde-haired, blue-eyed, come from money, and are Protestants in background. That's wild to me. Who made you the enforcer of whose pain is legitimate or not? It's just because you want to prove some kind of relationship or guilt or something about where you come from. And let's be honest, it doesn't really matter. What matters is what you are now and what you do with it. I don't say that to deny systemic racism at all. In fact, if anything, a lot of what I talk about proves the historical truth of his systemic racism. I feel the same way. WASP are lazy and entitled. Well, they definitely are. But even that's unfair. So my poetry works a lot of this stuff out. It's not obvious. It's not clearly political. I mean, I guess the closest thing to a clearly political poem that I've written is that poem Anger Song, which is about exhaustion. It's about the way activists will throw their heads against the wall for years and years and years and years, and they just burn themselves out because a lot of them are trying to, and Adorno talks about this, a lot of them are trying to get that vigor of the initial conflict, like the first time you ever fought with the cops, the first time you felt, the rush of a protest or something like that. They're trying to hunt that high down over and over and over again. And it's excuse me. It's impossible to do. You literally can't achieve it all the time, and you can become addicted to it. You can become. I mean, I think that's why people get addicted to riots and overpredict them, right? Because you have a feel of movement, even if it's purely destructive, purely negationary, even if it's not building anything. At least there's a break of the stasis of the people canceling each other out. This is a pretty, this is a week of exhaustion and flu, or in my case, COVID, talking as much as anything else. So you're getting a much more candid response to what I'm writing about and what I'm trying to do here. Someone asked me what Varn blog is aiming to do, since I believe that, a lot of things are like real drugs, man. You can become addicted to almost anything. For example, for those of you who are listening to this and not watching, I just tapped my soda can. This is an interesting question. Stalin's answer, what makes a great revolution, was someone with the dedication of the Bolshevik and pragmatism of American. What's yours? Is it anger? Is it a tendency for violence? No. Tendency for violence and anger are not inherently useful for revolutionary. Actually, in fact, I would say anyone who has a rush to violence is either probably a fed or someone you wouldn't want to deal with. I would say you would need the dedication of a desperate worker trying to ensure their family survives with the raw power of with a realistic view of the world. So yeah, pragmatism, sure, but that, I mean, a realistic view of the way human beings are, how you move about them, what you do. And then this is actually what Lenin defined as a good social democrat, and he was writing about this in his early period before he broke with social democracy. Must be able to move within all segments of the social class, know their biases, be able to get into their mind, understand what they're thinking, and then use that to their advantage. That's what you need to be able to do. And you need to be able to do that anyway. No, not all drugs work with the same dopamine factors. But anything that delivers dopamine to your body can act that way. That's what I mean. Like, anything's addictive. Some things are chemically addictive, which means they have a double incentive. They're producing things like dopamine in your body anyway. And marijuana is not one of the things that does that. But we should not overextend in any understanding of that. Yeah. But don't do drugs, kids, okay? And if anything, I would tell people, watch out for alcohol, particularly right now. This is no, it's way easier said than done. And in fact, what I would say, Matt, to that question or that statement, is that what I ask people to do about moving between social classes is something most people can't easily do. The reason why I picked it up, if I'm honest, I can now socially adjust to fulfill the needs of Ivy Leaguers and stuff. But even I have tells, right? There are tells that I have that would indicate my actual social class. And when I'm thinking about them, I can suppress them. And some of them have to do with just, I had the luck of getting higher education and international travel on someone else's dime. And that's pure luck. All right. Yes, I was meritocratic in order to get those opportunities, but 1,000 people had the same merits as me. 1,000 people are just as smart as me, and they would not have got that job. All right. This is a fundamental truth that I keep in my head. Right. My merit, my advantage, or whatever, is something that comes from luck, and having allies who not just were of a higher social class than me and a higher class background than me, and them mentoring me because they knew I needed to do certain things. Most people don't get that. Most people do not get that. I've also, my health hasn't always been great. As I say, talking to you and getting over COVID. What do you do to develop with restricted opportunities? That's actually a good question. And maybe like this is me as life coach and teacher, because this is something I teach my students. Learning, everyone has the ability to code switch already. All right. And I'm using educational jargon right now, but code switch is the ability, like you already socially adjust your speech and actions to different groups and coteries that you interact with on a daily basis. You already do it. Think about how you talk to your parents versus how you talk to your friends versus how you talk to your boss. All right. But those people are usually are one or two social classes removed from you. So you are extending stuff that you already know. The challenge is, how can you expose yourself to stuff you don't already know? And it's hard. Plus, you have to suppress a lot of your natural responses. The first leftist meeting I went in New York, and this is going to almost sound like a cliche, and I've told this story 100 times. All right. I've been to leftist meetings before in Atlanta and Georgia and all that. And I had gone to East Asia. And I learned Korean, and I knew a few phrases in Mandarin, but I didn't claim to speak Mandarin. And I was sitting with this crime think anarchist in a bar in Brooklyn, where my friends were actually taking me out for drinks. And my friends were all like, they were NYU people at Occupy. Some of them whom were attached to the platypus, some were not. And yeah, you don't have any idea how true that is for my case. For those of you who are listening and not watching, that is commenter Kristen West says, I got the answer. to how do you do that. They have a very strange childhood and then become charismatic and aimless. Code switching is it is a case of moving in your habitats and in social class and knowing what they are. So what you have to do is find models that you can watch to see what the other habitats are, and think about it the way and actively think about stuff that you implicitly already do. All right, what are you doing? What are you doing that is already like that? All right, like how do you appease people of this, that, and other social group? And I'll also tell you, the people who are often the worst at this are not actually like the poor and working class. People often are the worst at this are actually the very, very upper class, because they have the means to isolate themselves. This is one of the interesting things about like every research I saw, for example, on anti-Black racism in America. Like most of the research indicates that anti-Black racism becomes more apparent actually the more you move up the social class spectrum, even though people know to speak anti-racist language more and more. So what does that mean? Well, it means that, yeah, all your upper middle class white people know how to talk woke. But as I used to say, I live in West Salt Lake. If you don't know the geography of Salt Lake, West Salt Lake is rapidly gentrifying. West Salt Lake is rapidly gentrifying, but it is the Latino part of town, right? It's Latino and Asian. The people, my neighbors tend to be first and second generation immigrants. Spanish is spoken here as much as English. The restaurants over here are pretty authentic, and I can say that because I've lived in Mexico, and and a lot of them you need to speak Spanish to go into. And I worked with a bunch of people at a school who were afraid to come to my part of town because it is quote unquote dangerous. Now, these people are actively, anti-racist. They speak all this right stuff that you'd see on Twitter. Statistically speaking, the white part of town and the brown part of town in Salt Lake have almost identical crime rates. Salt Lake is not a very dangerous city. Yes, there is violence here. Yes, there's been a slight uptick in the murder rate recently, as there have been in most of the urban U.S. But what you don't see here is what I saw in the U.S. Southeast and the cities where parts of the certain cities look like the developing world. But yeah, they wouldn't come here. They give some excuse about it being dangerous. And statistically speaking, it's just not. And particularly for them, actually, to be honest. They were transplants mostly, actually. So someone's asking, were they Mormon or transplants? They were transplants. One of them was from New York. I just point this out to you. All right. I've encountered that kind of stuff all the time. When I was in New York, though, I was about to tell that story. This crime think anarchist guy who went to I believe he went to Sarah Lawrence. So he has money. And he was speaking near perfect Mandarin, although he'd never been to China, because he has money. And he shamed me for my accent being shitty in Korean. I, who had learned Korean literally by living there, had not, at that point, I haven't even had lessons. And that always stuck with me. That was 12 years ago. It was during Occupy. That was my first encounter with that left. My prior encounter with that left, and this is a cliche story, but it's a real one, was when I was coming out of my paleoconservative period and I was in graduate school, and Katrina happened and we went down there to help. And a bunch of middle class anarchists, and they were anarchists, and I'm not saying this to demean anarchism, made a whole lot of stink about us serving meat in a soup kitchen. And while I am not opposed to serving vegan food to poor people, if if it's tasty and talk up, and they're not either, honestly. We didn't have time for that. We were operating off of donated food. I didn't have time to say, oh, well, this is made out of dead animal that we didn't kill but is already dead, but so we can't serve it for someone's moral qualms. And they made a big stink in the kitchen until we had to kick them out. That was my first encounter. My second encounter was in New York, and where it was a real class difference. I mean, a very real class difference. Like the class difference there is even was much larger than what I'm talking about in New Orleans. And I bring this up because you do come from your own habitus, and you realize that. Like when I was a young, lower middle class, working class kid, my father was a mechanic, my mother was a waitress. She became a prison nurse later in my life. And I would go to my middle class friend's house. All right. Because I was super smart and did well in school after 10th grade, and I realized school was a game that I could play. And I actually tended to date even in high school above my social station. And I wasn't pretty. I'm still not pretty. It's not like you get prettier as you age. But I'm a charismatic. It's useful. And I would go to their houses, and these were $80,000 houses in 90s money, right? They're probably like $200,000, $300,000 houses now in Central Georgia, And because of the fact I grew up in a middle class neighborhood, and until my mom married my stepdad, we didn't even live in a house. We lived in multi-generational dwellings or apartments. And then when my mom married my stepdad, who was a mechanic, they bought us a small house in a mixed race middle class suburb with a decent school district to raise my brothers and I. I thought that was normal. And when I would go to my upper middle class friends' houses, and like I said, you're not even totally in a different segment of the population. Like, these are children of professors as opposed to the children of mechanics, right? I thought they were rich. It's embarrassing to me now how much I overstated our class difference. All right. That's why class resentment tends to be at the people nearest you. It's the first expression. You don't really know who the people who are in charge of your life are. You don't have exposure to them, particularly when you're young. Not as a working class person. So who do you hate? The PMC. And who's the PMC? Well, it's such a broad strata of income and people that it's still really vague. It's just people who are white collar as opposed to blue collar or whatever. Right? When I worked teaching diplomats' kids, when I was invited to the Mexican consulate dinner in Egypt, for example, which that's a funny story. I wore shorts. That was really embarrassing. But the houses were larger. People had their own bedrooms. That seems so absurd to me, right? I grew up in a house full of 6 people. We had 3 bedrooms. The idea that you would have personal space, I didn't have personal space like my own room until I was 30 years old. And that's the experience of a lot of the world, by the way. I mean, like, if you live outside the United States, that's not even particularly odd. But that's how I grew up. Now, when I got educated and then got introduced to people with Ivy League degrees and stuff and people with actual money, I felt stupid. At one party, this was during my MFA. I came from one of the poorest backgrounds in my MFA. I mean, it was me and like a couple of immigrant kids who really sympathized with one another because everybody else was like upper middle class, and they were talking about how I remember somebody talking about how their dad was a Sufi and they were hanging out with in an anarcho squat, but like also they had the money to live in New York, you know. But anyway, so my MFA, and I start meeting people with real wealth, and it's just, and I remember talking about, I was talking about how we're recruiting rich kids from the North Atlanta suburbs, and by rich kids, you're talking about kids from families, and again, this is 2005 money, and I was complaining about it because I'm like, I'm tired of all these people talking about equity when these are the same professors who are deliberately going out to recruit at this school that used to serve a local community that was poor, but since it's been made into a mid-tier university, is now recruiting from upper middle class suburbs in North Atlanta where the quote rich are. And my friend, who was the kind of person who had hung out with like Cheswoff's Mead Watch, was like, you don't know who the rich are. And she was absolutely right. As I was, like I said, as I learned going to New York, as I learned meeting people with Ivy League degrees, as I learned really beginning to move in with movers and shakers in politics and whatnot, I had no idea who the rich were. One of the things I tell people, about understanding people's class background and this difference when they complain to me about their income. And I always go, did your parents have the ability to support you on anything more than a couch for more than a few months? i.e., could you go back home and have a place to stay, the roof over your head, and food without working? If the answer is yes, then you still come from wealth. And you can sacrifice things at low income in a way that I cannot. Do not ever lecture me about money. I have friends in left publishing and stuff who their whole lives have had lower incomes than me. Yet they have houses and stuff. How is that? They go back and forth to Europe all the time. How is that? Now, as a person who was able to jet set on someone else's dime, I know how much it costs to fly back and forth between continents, usually on the order of $1,000 at minimum. Now, I'll do that all the time on someone else's dime, but I quit traveling abroad when I lived outside of the United States, when I came back to the United States, because frankly, it's too expensive. Publishing is full of people that can burn money because to work in publishing, you have to have the money to burn. That's also true for a lot of left stuff. Most left, I was talking about this early in my stream earlier. Malatesta, Stalin, whoever, they often were involved in some pretty high-level bank robberies and stuff you can't do anymore. You can't get away with it. But they were doing that because to be a leftist and to join a union and to be part of these parties meant putting money in people's pockets and food on their table. That was a part of the mass parties that people forget. They always talk about the collective good. They always talk about this or that, right? Because that's a way to give students with leisure time to come in and do stuff for you. Yeah, you're right, and it's useful for that, right? But it's a lot harder to get away with bank robberies these days. I'm not saying one couldn't. I'm just saying it takes a lot more technical skill. But like, yeah. But joining the left back then was not just a matter of ideals. Ideals are for people with leisure time. Plane tickets are cheap right now. If you don't mind waiting COVID, yeah, you can fly anywhere if you want. If you have a place to stay. But that's not wasn't the expensive part of travel even back then. And sometimes plane tickets were quite high. You got to get there in the United States for one thing. So there you go. And so when I talk to people about learning how to do this and how to code switch and this and the other, that's what I tell people. I always used to, for most of my teaching career, I taught at schools that were like 50, 60% black or brown, and Sean's here, and like 80% poor. All right. I haven't had the luxury of teaching at schools that even if they weren't technically Title I, they were Title I by definitional means. And I would always teach people how to code switch, and we would always try to, people like, oh, they don't need to do that. And I it was always upper middle class people telling them that. And I would sit them as, I'd sit my students aside and I was like, I wish we lived in a world where you didn't have to do this. I wish you lived in a world where you didn't have to feel like you had to change who you are to fit into the people who actually run the world. But we don't live in that world. And no matter what said liberal ass teacher tells you, however they fix your grades, however they pass you through to make you feel better about yourself. All right. They're not doing you any services by doing that for you. All right. I mean, I know how colleges work. I've used to work in the college. I've worked in colleges for a long time. Unless the state fiat says they can't, they adjust based on your zip code, what they expect from you. I'm actually, one of the things I'm actually somewhat sympathetic to Freddie DeBoer about, and I have my issues with Freddie, but a lot of them actually. But one thing I worry about is now that we're getting rid of all these tests because they're systemically racist. All you're going to have is the biases of literally the acceptance commissions. That's it. Because the grades are already discounted because they're so relative to where you live. Puya, I'm going to ask you a question. I like how people are like stating as if they don't know it. A high school degree is increasingly less valuable. It's still pretty valuable, but it's increasingly less valuable. I'm thinking about how I'm going to word this in a way that doesn't come off as really mean. There is no amount of code switching that you can do that will overcome people's innate bias. But to do none at all, you will have no chance. And to pretend there isn't a difference is fundamentally dishonest. And that's not just for race. That's also for class. I still have tells. The biggest tell is I can't drop all my Southern accent. I can't. You might not hear it at all now, but I drank soda, not water. Hear it? I can't change that. That's a shibboleth. It's always there. And if you're ethnic, you're going to have even more of it. Ethnic. Man, that's some code. Right? And you shouldn't have to give it up. But if someone tells you you can just like will yourself and that people aren't going to prejudice you, that is just a lie. That's just an utter lie. Man, that's some upper middle class. No, yeah, people ask all the time what I do for a living. I've noticed leftists at universities who will listen to me pontificate for hours. The moment they find out I'm a high school teacher and not a professor anymore, automatically treat me differently, as if I'm a moron. I've been a professor. I choose not to be, but yeah, of course. But there's all these things. All these social signals are very, very real, and we have to be very, very honest with them. You know, you can't lie to a student about this, or anybody, actually. Right? Like, we can't pretend these are not things that are that are not useful or real. And if we don't have any outside tests, as biased as they are, I mean, like, there's reason, like, it's impossible to remove the bias out of a test based on language. Right? There will always be a bias based on a test based on language. One of the most fascinating problems I ever had is some of the biases are weird. The TOEFL test, for example, disproportionately punishes mistakes from people from Asian languages as opposed to Indo-European languages. So if you're from an Asian language that doesn't have articles or prepositions, the rules of the TOEFL are going to hurt you more than it hurts Latino, Spanish, French speakers, etc. And I find that fascinating because in almost all other fields of the United States, being someone from a Spanish-speaking country puts you at a distinct disadvantage from an immigrant who makes it here from Asia. But the immigrants who make it here from Asia tend to, like I said, the rules are actually written in such a way that they have to be richer than their equivalent, except for from South Korea. Actually, that's literally the exception that I know about. The quotas are different based on where you're from, and you're like, even if you marry an American, the likelihood you're able to get your staying visa varies greatly depending on what country you're from, etc. You guys have no idea how much of a jerk I can be. You haven't dealt with me in person. My partner will tell you I'm the kind of person who will try to save your village, but if you won't let me save your village, I'll burn your village down and salt the earth. This is a good point. The first licensing exam for medicine in the U.S. Because of PF 2 weeks ago had to use to be PF, but the numerical scores were reported. Over time, they were used to filter out people. Now the programs are freaking out. Yeah, they are. They don't know how to do it now. There's no such thing as meritocracy, and there's no way for there to be. Like, it's not just like a flaw in the system. Like there, like, the skills of being an academic entail certain skills that if you are from a higher level social class, you're more likely to have and just know and have the people to help you teach them. Anyone who gets into those things from lower level classes, even if they're smart, or they come from outside of the United States, even if they're smart, unless they're European, as at a distinct disadvantage. I'm sure any immigrant in the U.S. will tell you that. I'll also say that that Europe in this regard is probably worse. And I'm sure there's some. I know there's someone here who's studied in both the Europe and the U.S. and can say that. A lot of people can make good money in blue collar jobs if they're willing to break their back, particularly if they're petit bourgeois and are willing to own their own business. And there are patterns for that. I talked about that the other day. Like, there's a reason why, for example, African American and Black people. It's just I hate the term African American. It's confusing. This is a good question. Thoughts what happens? The American education system is doomed. I'm laughing because I know it. The entire 15 years I've worked in education, we have been at about a 30 to 50% attrition rate of 3 to 5 year teachers. That's about to accelerate. There are very few teachers in my age cohort, which is people with more than 10 years experience, who are not up into their 50s and 60s. The pressures on them are getting worse, and that's accelerating the death spiral. So in Utah, for example, which has one of the worst student-teacher ratios in the country, the average high school classroom has about 40 to 45 students in it, a class. We were already 20% down on our quota, and they were beginning to raise pay in a serious way for beginning teachers, only for beginning teachers, but whatever. And where we're at now, yeah. Well, I mean, so I teach in an online program, and I have about 50 kids per class assigned to me. And if they could get away with more, they would. The district would. Oh, my district's not bad to me. I don't want to talk down about them too much. Also, it's my job, and you could probably figure out where I work if you really tried, even though I never mention it. But that's doable online, right? Even though for essays, it means that sometimes I'm grading 300 essays a week, in addition to whatever I give you guys, and having a life. You guys wonder, like, when I say I don't sleep, I mean it. About a ton of teachers are going to leave the profession. Here in SLC, though, they're also losing a ton of students to charter schools, other districts, etc. So they're also going to be letting go about 45 teachers because the population of kids are leaving the city. Because the people who can afford to live in the city of Salt Lake now is beginning to become more and more like California cities. Families can't afford to live here, so they're moving out to the suburbs. And that includes families of color. Basically, what I was implying in where I live in Salt Lake is increasingly the Latino families who own their houses here, bought them for $100,000 here years ago, are selling them and making bank and moving out. But they're having to buy houses that are so much more expensive that they're basically just treading water. So we are seeing class sizes increasing, yet we'll also be closing schools due to charters, whatever. Charters are also getting closed left and right because most of them are scams. The average rent in LSC has gone from, when I moved here, the average rent for a one bedroom was about, I think, $1,000. And now an average rent for a one bedroom apartment is now about $1,300 to $1,400. The average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment is probably about $2,000. Property tax rate is actually lower here than normal. I rent a house for much less than that, but then again, me and my partner together, I mean, like, in income, we're effectively upper middle class. I don't pretend to be something I'm not. I'm just telling you where I come from. Yeah, well, except it happened really fast here. So like I've literally seen rents rise here dramatically in just 5 years. I've only lived, I was outside of the United States for 8 years prior to that when I came here. Property values currently just blew up. That's part of why the Fed is. Yeah, thanks coming in, Puya. It's nice to see you again. This is totally a stream. Normally, I'm more coherent in my rants. Check out the book. I'll put it when I post it on my Patreon. I'll put that link there for you. Mel Marcel's better for me. Although, guys, I'm not gonna make a lot of money off a poetry book. This property value seems currently unstable. They are, which is part of why the Fed's probably going to raise the interest rate, but it's going to have downstream repercussions, man. I think this is why. No. I don't know how the book's distributed at all. It's a one man. It's like a one man. It's a very small press out of New York. I don't even think it's got like my old books on Amazon. I don't think this will be. Oh well. Also, you can buy my old book if you want it. It's available on Amazon through Unlikely Stories. Or through the Unlikely Stories Press. This is still available. So my first book is through Unlikely Books, which is through SPD, and it's available on Amazon. My second book is through Mysterioso Books, and it's available from Mysterioso Books. Small plus distributors, no. Although Unlikely Book has talked about working with them before. I used to give money to small plus distributors because I get good poetry books from them. If you want to talk about my petite bourgeois artist crap, then we can definitely talk about that. Although poetry, by the way, is the most pathetic form of petite bourgeois art. We really do it because we love it or because we have a professorial job. There's really no other reason to do it. Somebody was asking me about my Lash book, and so and it hasn't come up, but I want to talk about that a little bit. So the Lash book is on indefinite hiatus because it's not just my books. Oh, cool, Matt. The Lash book was commissioned by Zero Books. I was asked to write it based on discussions I used to have with Doug Lane privately on early Lash, and my best friend, one of my three best friends in the whole wide world, Shalyn Van Tyne, it works under Kevin Masterson at University of Maryland, I believe. No, University of Ohio, one of those two universities, and thus had access to Lash archives, and we decided to write the book together. Shalyn's going to finish her dissertation on the history of Gen X music, which is, she's a social historian working in music. Shalyn is brilliant. She is a good part of half my brand on Lash, and my refinement and understanding of Lash is largely due to my engagement with her. So until she finishes her dissertation, we have put it on hiatus because the publisher that commissioned it the person who commissioned it at Zero, doesn't work for Zero anymore, as it's been bought out by Watkins and Repeater. And I don't have a negative relationship with Repeater. I don't have a lot of bad things to say about them. In fact, I like the people who run the podcast. But I am putting it on the back burner for now and writing another poetry book, a third poetry book. I'm still reading for Lash, but Sean and I, we're going to pick it up and write a series of articles that we're going to farm out in articles first. Also, Shalyn deals with my aphasia pretty well. She knows what I mean. Most people don't. And so, that's one of the reasons why I chose poetry, not prose, as my preferred more genre of working, is because I'm aphasic and I can proofread poetry, but prose is much harder. It takes a lot longer to do. When I write an essay for publication, I often, or even for a blog, I often will have to rewrite it 5-10 times over the course of a month. That's why I quit doing a blog. And so when everyone's like, well, why don't you write a book? I'm like, well, because it's literally hard for me to do. I guess it's hard for everybody, but whatever. Yeah. Well, we're going to do another combo on Lash. I think we have a combo on Lash scheduled for Exploding Appendix podcast over the summer. And Shalyn's coming back onto my show to talk about music and movies, what she was a social historian on. One Dime is coming on. So if you guys want me to go over I'll talk about profit rates in a minute. That's a good question. But let me go over the publication schedule. Not publication schedule. See, you guys got me thinking about books. On my, let's see here. So, who's coming on when? Max C-Ho is coming on. C-Ho. Yeah, he's is coming on tomorrow from Superstructure Podcast. Parker McQueenie from the DSA, and I believe he sometimes writes for Cosmonaut, will be coming on the 9th. Karen Spring will be recorded finally on Friday, but it won't be live streamed, so it'll come out later. And then Stephen Hamill's coming back. Then I'll be releasing some stuff I'm recording during the next week. Then on Friday the 18th, Mir Ball will be coming on to talk about the situation in Sweden. So you get another perspective on Europe, so I'm not just stuck with Anton. And then One Dime will be coming on that day too, for audio only. So you will need to listen to the audio podcast for that. And it'll come out the next week. So if you're looking for One Dime, you'll look, that should come out sometime between the 24th and 25th of February. And we're not going to debate. We are going to talk about some things. I think One Dime's pretty smart. He's got an interesting idea. His critiques of MMT are similar to mine. His understanding of MMT is not similar to mine. So I really kind of want to parse out where the differences really are and why he feels the way he does. So I'm looking forward to that. But it's not a debate. I don't do that shit. Debate leads to things like Tu Quote Quang and, well, Marxists did this too, which I'm always like, yeah, sure, Marxists suck. Like, have you dealt with Marxists? We're awful. Look at the debate about whether or not Marxist is science in Twitter. There's nothing that makes me sound it makes me less excited about life than seeing that. Dr. Haroon, you might know him from TAR, will be on the 23rd. Greg Belvedere and a trans woman from Australia, Roxy, I don't know her last name, will be coming on during the 25th. They'll be released later. I have a recording with Sean KB sometime around then. Oh, I have a lot of stuff coming out with science. It's just not coming out this month. And I'm trying to get I'm actually talking to 3 of my friends who work in nursing to come on and talk about what's going on with nurses during COVID. So I'm going to try to get some like working people on the show to talk about what's going on in their job. I've also have invited 3 different climatologists on. I haven't got any of them have said yes yet, to talk about the situation with climate change. And how to make climate change discussions not about virtue signaling. That's next month. The month after that, I have the What is Politics guy, DB, coming on to talk about David Graeber. Let me go through all this for you. I have Simon Kangaroo also coming on to talk about MMT. I have Dr. Dre Monroe to come in about critical understanding of cloud computing, and understanding the limits of cybernetic theory. I have Mike Ken coming on to talk about PTSD veterans and also the history of Korea and American relations. I have Jared Levy coming on to talk about anti-communism, and how it's been damaging to the American left. I have Dr. John Rasmus coming on in April to talk about politics from a non-MMTers perspective, but still heterodox. I have sent invites to Michael Hudson, to some other people, and I want to talk to some artists. I'm also going to invite some people who are doing critical stuff on science. And then, like I said, I've talked to at least 3 nurses, and I've gotten at least 1 tentative yes and another maybe on talking about nursing in the pandemic, and also what it's like to being of gender relations in the medical field. Those are both coming up. I realize it's, to run a show where we talk to theorists and historians all the time, we're also talking about class. I should probably talk to people who work in different sectors of society. This is a very eclectic podcast, and I maintain to keep it eclectic. So you'll see all kinds of topics coming up. I'm also got artists coming on, and I still got some psychoanalytic weirdos coming up too. It's just now you're looking into the summer. You will notice I tend to book about a month and a half ahead. So yeah. So those are the questions about who's coming on. And I had one last substantive question that's a little bit complicated. So I'm going to answer it. It's the last question I'm really going to take tonight. And then I'm going to lay down. I am feeling better, by the way, which is why I'm doing so many of these. But I'm still in isolation for another 4 days because I don't want to get my partner sick. My fever just broke this morning, so do you think having 5 to 10 absolutely huge companies like Amazon and Google eating into profits in so many industries is partly behind low profit rates? Yes, but that's part of the classic understanding of monopolization actually lowering profit rates in general. They can raise their own profits kind of for a short period of time, but it gets harder and harder to do as very capital fixes get harder and harder to make. That's the long answer. I mean, the key answer is like some of that is what's driving inflation too. In addition to cost push inflation and demand pull inflation, there's also monopoly pricing inflation. And there's also energy sinks and larger organizations and more centralized organizations are also a thing that you can model in physics that also apply to business corporations. This is why I did this whole thing back when I was doing Nailing It Down, which I will pick back up in March, by the way, or February, excuse me, by the way. Is that, believe it or not, it seems like centralization will reduce complexity, but it often doesn't. And that creates more and more administrative overhead and literal sinks of energy and money, which means that profit margins get harder and harder to maintain because you have more things in which you're sinking energy and thus cost into the system. All right. So centralization is only more efficient when it actually reduces the amount of energy sinks in a system. But if it's just nominal, organization, because this hyper complexity is now just under the rubric of one corporation and not many, it's not actually simplifying the situation, and particularly in something that deals in multiple different kinds of things. That's also true for governments, by the way, which is why centralized versus decentralized is kind of a dumb question. It's what, how, and where. That's my understanding anyway. But what do I know? I'm a poet. Any other things you guys want to talk about before I head on out? My partner is probably like, Varn he can't hang out with me, so he's just talking to the void all night. She's right, by the way. So that's what's going to go with the book. I hope you guys check out that book if you get a chance. Thank you for coming in and listening to me tonight. I know this is not my normal historical rant. This is mostly personal ramblings. But it's something that I think maybe would give you some insight into the way I think and why I am the way I am. I am a human being, despite rumors to the contrary. I'm not just a pill that you take to make yourself really jaded. But I also will say this as a warning. I am very careful about what parts of my private life that I share and these kinds of things, or on Twitter or Facebook in particular. Facebook's a little harder because I actually have real personal relationships on Facebook. Because I've seen people use their life as a form of entertainment. And it destroys their private life completely. I can think of some left influencers who have weirder and weirder positions, chasing more and more stuff from like BreadTube to StalinTube or whatever, where you've literally seen their marriages fall apart, their relationships fall apart in public, their fights between their spouse being held through Twitter. I will never be that guy. And you shouldn't be either. It will destroy your life. You are making yourself a total commodity to be consumed. You are not sharing yourself with your audience. You are making yourself a commodity to be destroyed and eaten and cannibalized. Don't do it. So while I'll talk to you about my past and some of my personal stuff on the streams like this, it will never be the primary form of entertainment. We will, we're not going down that route. I'm not doing it. All right. Yeah, it is a bummer about the book and Lash, but we are working on it. What's not persuasive? I was like, uh-oh. The electronic fidelity they hardly meant has come to be their final blazon. What will survive of us is spite. By the way, it's the last line of A Portrait of an Arundel tune by Philip Larkin, or the last stanza in that line. And I changed to fit the internet. But even that poem has a subtle irony to it. You should read the original. Larkin's a bitter, bitter, bitter old man, but I love him. Unfortunately, a lot of the better poets in the English tradition are reactionaries. But whatever, what are you going to do? All right. And with that, I really am off. Have a good night. Take care of yourself. Be well. Keep yourself sane.